Agree to disagree. I'll take phrases that no longer have relevance for 1,000, Alex. From cancellation to no contact, it seems like public discourse is in the toilet. How did we get here? My next guest studies and teaches influence. He's a psychologist, behavioral scientist, and the founder and CEO of a consulting practice called Influence 51. Today, we're going to unpack persuasion, perception, and arguing on the internet as we ask the question, can you actually change someone's mind? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome the man helping humanity rebound from democratic backsliding, author, changemaker, listens to rap and Disney cover songs in the gym, Dr. JonRobert Tartaglione. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And thank you for probably one of the better introductions I've ever had. That was fantastic. I think it really captured me as a person.
I think it did too. I think you did too. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And so I actually want to start with, since part of your education background is philosophy, we'll start with a little definition, right?
Sure. Let's do it.
So persuasion, you've said in other interviews that persuasion isn't a battle of ideas. If that's true, then what is persuasion?
Persuasion is a hard thing to give a concrete definition to. A lot of people have this idea that, if I'm going to persuade someone, what I need to do is I need to create an argument that can overpower their arguments, right? That ultimately, if I could hit them with enough data and statistics, they will have to submit to, this realization that, hey, they have the better argument, and so I have to change my mind.
Yeah, like some old-timey battle, like knights battle.
Exactly.
Exactly. I surrender.
So here's the thing, right, is I think we need to differentiate between what is going to be useful technique-wise in debate club, where people appreciate debate as an art, and people are trying to kind of judge arguments on merit, and what's going to work in the actual real world. Now, in a debate club, right, if I make a particularly cogent argument, you, as someone who kind of, values debate in its purest form, are going to kind of acknowledge that, hopefully, and you're going to say, hey, that was a great point. And maybe we can find, in debate, right, we go from thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? In the best form of debates, that's how debates should run. I give an argument, you provide a counter argument, and we try to find the logical middle ground, right, where both of our arguments can coexist. But if we go into kind of, spheres outside of just debating for debating's sake, the challenge is that individuals often aren't ready to acknowledge when someone has made a point that goes against their worldview that they can agree with, right? So when we are debating in these kind of, let's say, online forums, part of the challenge is that I am not debating to try to find compromise. I am debating to win. I am debating not to lose, and I am debating to make sure I look good in front of my group. And so debates in these spheres, rather than leading to potential synthesis, actually get people further entrenched in the views they've already come in with.
Okay, so it sounds like real life debating has a lot to do with performance.
It's yes, but I want to caveat that. So It has to do with performance, but a lot of people hear performative and it has this kind of pejorative connotation, right? You're being performative and you're being disingenuous. A lot of debates in real life, people are being performative in the sense that they are trying to show someone that they are a good group member, right? That I'm trying to kind of signal to my group that I'm defending our perspective. But they're not doing that in a way that is superficial, right? To understand why that type of kind of performative debating is so crucial, we have to understand why our social natures are so important to human beings, right? We'd have to go back tens of thousands of years and talk a little bit about evolution. Now, humans haven't evolved to experience just physical pain. We've evolved to experience social pain because the threat of not being included in a group, being excluded or ostracized from your group, had very real consequences in the evolutionary environment, right? If you were rejected from the group, you died. Social rejection was a threat to your survival in the same way that physical rejection was. And so humans have evolved to experience social rejection in just as visceral a way. And so when we do these kind of performances for our groups, it's not a superficial thing. It's us trying to say, hey, I rely on this group for my social survival. I don't want to be kicked out. And that's a hard thing to deal with when you're trying to change someone's mind.
So it sounds like people making a certain stance, their whole personality, is not new. Because I kind of thought that was an internet thing. Like, you know how people are like, they're pro or con, whatever, and it's their whole internet presence. It's their whole internet footprint. Like their Instagram handle it's like the whole thing. And I kind of had a mental note to even ask you about that because I thought, well, surely this would prohibit people from being open-minded to start off with when their whole existence depends on them holding strong to a certain way of thinking. Like, then they wouldn't be very open-minded. And I thought that was like an internet phenomenon, but it sounds like it's a human phenomenon.
It's a really hard thing to deal with, right? When it comes to persuasion, to think differently or see something from a different perspective, some of it does come down to how secure are they in their identity, in their belief that they kind of have a certain standing within a group. So I'll give you a quick example. In the corporate world, research on things called idiosyncrasy credits. Okay, basically, if you've been on a team for a very long time, you become less likely to succumb to things like groupthink, right? Because you've earned what are called idiosyncrasy credits, which is basically, I have the leeway amongst my group. I have the respect of them that I can kind of deviate from the group opinion without being ostracized from the group. And you kind of earn these idiosyncrasy credits as you become a more and more valued member of the group, a more clear member of the group. Whereas individuals that are very new to groups, especially in corporate settings, they're often engaged in groupthink because this is their way of signaling that, hey, I agree with what everyone's saying. I'm one of the team. You know, I'm here to kind of do what you guys want to do. When you go to ideologies can be very much like that too. So when you talk about being kind of liberal or conservative or being pro-life or pro-choice, some individuals who are less secure in their identity, for lack of a better term right now, some individuals will just kind of inherit whatever identity their group gives them. Others build their ideology and then decide what group that they belong to, right? These individuals are committed to the ideology more than the group. Now, these individuals that are committed more to the ideology than the group, if the ideology starts to shift or falter or fail, maybe they're willing to kind of, see the cracks in that. But if you believe whatever the group believes, you're going to continue to believe whatever the group believes until there's been a shift in the overall group belief that they kind of pass down to you. That's a really hard thing to manage because these people aren't really committed to an ideology per se. They're committed to being a good part of the group. And sometimes that's whatever ideology that group wants to hold, I'm going to hold it to.
So are we as polarized as, the media makes out, or is the media just giving us what we deserve?
That's a really good question. As a nice way to put it too. Are we polarized? Let's start there. The answer, according to the data, is yes. Americans are polarized. Americans have been polarized for quite some time. And by some metrics, Americans are more polarized than many other nations in the world. Are we as polarized as we believe ourselves to be is a completely different question. Because what we find is if we look at longitudinal data, we're talking data that goes back decades, 30, 40 years, Americans routinely overestimate how far away Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservatives actually are on issues. We have this pattern, again, that goes back literally 3-4 decades of polling where we overestimate how polarized we are by huge numbers. We're not just talking like 5%. We're talking closer to like 30, 40%. And part of the reason that happens is really not surprising. I mean, you talked about one of them, the fact that media has been built to cater to these echo chambers. Everyone always talks about, hey, it would be really nice if we had kind of this unbiased media. And some nations have tried to institute kind of unbiased media. I'm calling in from London right now. I'm an American, but I'm living in London. The BBC makes efforts to be unbiased, to be neutral. But that's a state-funded media platform. The challenge with media platforms that aren't funded, that rely on viewership, is that most people want to tune in to just hear what they already believe reflected back to them, right? They want the ammunition to be able to say, hey, I believe that immigrants are ruining this country, or I believe immigrants are great for this country. I want media to tell me I'm right and tell me how I can defend that argument. And so we don't really end up getting media that is unbiased because most people don't want media that's unbiased. That's not what we tune into. That's not what the market kind of demands. But the second thing is, part of the challenge comes from what I will call pluralistic ignorance. The vast majority of outspoken individuals tend to be the ones that hold the most extreme views, right? If I'm incredibly passionate about being a conservative, or I'm incredibly passionate about being a liberal, I'm more likely to speak up. And I'm more likely to speak up in a very kind of, fervent way about these socio-political issues. Now, if I happen to be a progressive individual by nature, I'm quite a liberal individual. But if I'm a little bit more of a moderate liberal in many ways, especially because a lot of my work and a lot of my professional life is spent kind of talking to conservatives and trying to, come to compromises. So a very hardcore liberal kind of stands up in a room and they start, spouting off about incredibly liberal topics and holding a very extremist view. And a few people are nodding along. Well, I don't hold that view, but I look around and I think, okay, this person's speaking up. People are nodding. A lot of people must hold this view. So I'm not going to speak up because I'm probably in the minority. Unbeknownst to me, a lot of other moderates are doing the same exact thing. And so you get this misperception that the most vocal people are also representative of the larger group, and it's just not the case, and that's the case on both sides of the aisle. And so when we constantly hear the most extreme views and the most extreme people being the most vocal, we end up getting this skewed perception of how polarized we actually are.
So how do we keep ourselves from getting sucked into those political extremes when there's no systematic incentive for political parties to operate in that reasonable middle?
Good question. I don't know if there's an answer to that right now. I think, seriously, I think that's a very, very good question. We probably do require some sort of systemic or structural interventions within our system in order to kind of reroute the ship in that way. Otherwise, I don't know if there are kind of individualized interventions that would be powerful enough to be able to kind of turn course.
Well, we also really love entertainment. And I think that could be part of the freaking problem, because on the one hand, you're like, okay, pluralistic ignorance, people are like, oh God, they're saying that and they're saying that. I guess I won't say that. I'm avoiding conflict. While at the same time, let me tune into The View and watch 5 women talk over each other. I personally, if you couldn't tell, I don't understand the draw to that. So,
I agree with you. And I think it kind of, you have pressure pushing in both directions. From the media standpoint, you're absolutely right? As a media entity, I need to create content that's going to get me viewers. And I have viewers that want a little bit more extremism. They want those, sexy clips of people arguing or, making a really harsh statement towards the other side. Things like moderation and really civil debate doesn't really sell. Part of the other challenge is human beings have a tendency to view neutral information as being hostile towards their viewpoint. So there's something called the hostile media effect, okay? Basically what the hostile media effect is if you hold a very strong view, let's say something like Israel-Palestine, right? Let's say that you and I hold very strong views that are polar opposites to one another on that issue. If you were to bring in a group of scientists whose job was just to present the facts as they stand with absolutely no coloring of any opinion whatsoever, what ends up happening is, let's say that, I was in support of Palestine. I see that neutral presentation of the facts as being biased against me, because that's not what I believe. That's not the facts as I know them. And so I say, you are biased. You look at it as being a supporter of Israel. You see these same exact neutral facts as being biased towards you, because that's not how you see the world. Those aren't the facts to you. And so what ends up happening is individuals trying to kind of maintain that middle ground end up suffering from both sides, because both sides see them as being hostile towards their point of view. And so what ends up happening is you create this kind of disincentive for being moderate, because I can't win with both groups, and so I might as well try to win with one of them.
Hey, you know what's crazy? YouTube told me that only 3.9% of those of you who watch are actually subscribed to the channel. If you want to see me again, consider hitting subscribe and turn on the notifications for new episodes. Okay, back to the show. That's where fighting becomes the point.
Yeah.
Well, and then you have these, to kind of go back to the, talking, yelling heads on media and social media, they become like caricatures. I feel like they hurt their own cause. Like, say someone represents one particular political party and they say some wild ass shit all the time with confidence on the television. There's people on both sides that represent this, by the way. You know that very well. And so here's what happens is the people on the other side of the political line go, wow, them bitches are crazy. Those guys are crazy. And so when they run into a family member over, a holiday, and they realize that family member belongs to said political party, they put them in the bucket with the crazies. And actually, you call this a perception gap, I think. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so in this context, challenge is really twofold. The first challenge is recognizing the perception gap. The second challenge is understanding that you have to be very delicate with how you make fun of this individual who deserves to be made fun of if they're kind of spouting off some absolutely ridiculous things, without potentially threatening the ego, the identity of this relative who often kind of sides with this person. This person is part of their so-called tribe, their ideological or political tribe. And that's where, I say the most important thing to understand about persuasion is that your approach matters the most. It actually has very little to do with the argument itself. And when we get to the argument part, when we get to kind of presenting our thoughts and feelings, things like message framing, different tactics you can use are incredibly powerful. But the point is most people don't get to the point of being able to use those things because they don't take an approach that enables someone to say, hey, I'm willing to hear what you have to say. I'm willing to kind of listen and not defend. And I'm willing to reconsider a point of view that I hold very dear. That's a very hard place to get to.
Yeah, it is. So how do we do that?
Well, we can talk about that.
Well, talk to me about approach, because you were just saying like approach matters. So maybe let's start with like what not to do. So because that might be more relatable, sadly.
I think here's what I'll do is I will let me start off with a little bit of a hypothetical situation. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you are in your front yard. Okay, you're in your garden. You're planting flowers. And you see me walking by. I'm on the other side of your fence. I'm on the street. I'm holding the most beautiful plant you've ever seen. And as you're kind of watching me walk by with this plant, all of a sudden, I jump your fence, okay, without your permission. I run towards the other side of your garden. I start digging it up and trying to plant this plant in your garden. How are you going to react to that? Are you
defensively?
Defensively, right? You're going to immediately get defensive. You're going to try to push me off your property. You're going to say, what the hell are you doing here? That's how all of us are going to react, right? With defensiveness and agitation, and maybe even aggression. Now, I want you to notice something about this, okay? I use this example because I like to say that the best way to think about another person's mind, especially someone who doesn't agree with you, think of it as private property, okay? You can't just bust onto someone's private property and expect them not to react with defensiveness and agitation. It's the same thing with new ideas or new thoughts, right? If you aren't ready to have that conversation and I all of a sudden try to, blindside you with all the reasons why you're wrong, well, guess what? You're going to react defensively because I'm trying to come onto your private property, your mind, and I'm trying to change it against your will. And there's another really important thing about the scenario I gave. I said I was carrying the most beautiful flower, beautiful plant you had ever seen. And I use this because that's the same thing as our ideas. It doesn't matter how good of an idea you're bringing on. If you're bringing it on in the wrong way, you're still going to try to push them off the property. And so we need to figure out ways to be invited onto someone's private property. We need to get them to a situation, to a point where they don't feel threatened. They don't feel like I'm going to come in there and try to give you an aha moment or make you feel foolish. They don't feel like I'm going to try to embarrass you in front of your group. You need to get them to a point where they invite you onto their property and say, hey, I'm willing to think critically about your ideas and my own if we can do it in a way that doesn't make me feel threatened. That's easier said than done, but that's the first step.
That's a big first step.
It's a very big first step. But it's part of the reason, by the way, that most online, if you can call them debates, go absolutely no. Is because those individuals aren't trying to actually listen to one another and reflect on their own ideas. They're simply in a fight. They're in a debate that doesn't have a winner or loser. They both are trying to defend their positions and make sure that they don't come out being embarrassed.
How is it possible that what you said is just true? We can't change people's minds on the internet, but also young men are being radicalized and becoming violent incels on the internet. How can both things be true?
I think that there is a big difference between changing someone's mind on a socio-political issue and seeing someone change on the internet in the way that you're describing, these kind of, as I call them, the incels, right? As human beings, it is in our nature to a degree to want to see ourselves as individuals who can control our own destiny, right? And a lot of times we are fed, this belief that if you do what you're supposed to do, then you're going to be successful, right? I think part of the challenge on the internet right now is you have a lot of individuals, quite frankly, often look like me, right? Kind of straight white men who aren't progressing in the world the way they want to be progressing. They feel like they were promised things by whom, I don't know, but they were promised things that they weren't getting, that they feel they deserve. And they're looking for ways to not have to blame themselves. They're looking for things that will enable them to not have to put in work on themselves. That's a really hard thing to do. It's often easier to be able to just point the blame at a scapegoat out there as opposed to kind of shining a harsh flashlight on ourselves. And so I think that type of change comes much easier because it's the change that we want and that requires us to do the least amount of effort. Change when it comes to kind of ideological change, socio-political change, that's hard because you're trying to change someone in a direction they don't want to go in. That type of change is really, really challenging because in order to change someone's mind on a really key issue, you have to make them feel vulnerable. They have to be able to acknowledge that there were faults in the way they thought of the world before. They have to be able to come to terms with the fact that if they change this view, there are other views that might be impacted. They have to come to terms with the fact that they were wrong about something. And so there might be cracks in their armor, other places in their identity. That's change in a direction we don't want to go in.
Okay, so then what's the point of political ads? Because, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because
that's a good question.
Because it's like, okay, well then is the goal of a political ad just to make sure that people who were already going to vote for you get out there and vote? Because I thought it was like trying to sway people. Am I totally naive?
From a political strategist point of view, there are two things you want to do as a political strategist. You're going to identify who is your base? Who are the people that already agree with me that we want to get them to go out and vote? And who are the undecideds? Who are the actual people in the middle who haven't made a decision? That middle is often quite slim. People who are actually movable within the middle is quite low. But basically, you have kind of two strategies for going at these groups. The former group, your whole thing is about making sure they go out and vote. But then you have this middle group, which is the kind of persuadable group. For here, political ads like you're talking about are designed to try to persuade individuals, right? There are political ads that are trying to kind of persuade people, but they are the minority of political ads. You're absolutely right. The vast majority of political ads are simply trying to rile up a base that they know they already had their support and get them to go out and vote.
I wonder if, kind of bringing it back to the personal, the stuff that we can control, because we can't control political campaigns. Like they'll always just be the bane of our existence, I think. But when it comes to like individuals arguing online, I'm getting the impression here that it's just never gonna end in the result that you want. And so I'm wondering if your advice is just to not do it, or if you actually have tried and true strategies that tend to be more productive than others.
When it comes to arguing online, there are many factors that are working against you in terms of ever getting someone to change their mind, right? The number one thing is the public nature of it. Humans are hypersocial creatures. I know that when I'm arguing publicly online, it's not just about kind of what I think, but it's also about what my group thinks about me. I need to be a good representative for my group. And unfortunately, we do live in a little bit of political environment and atmosphere where admitting that my group might be wrong is not going to be taken very well. And it's kind of a double-edged sword for someone, right? Where if I am, let's say I'm a conservative and someone starts debating me on a conservative issue, if I start to kind of acknowledge that, hey, what you're saying is right, not only do I run the risk of alienating my conservative brethren who support me, but I also don't know, if I'm going to be supported by the group that I'm siding with, right? I'm going to end up a man with no support whatsoever. That's a very vulnerable position to be in. The second thing that you're contending with when you're trying to kind of debate people in a public sphere, it is a phenomenon we call cognitive dissonance, right? We want that our behaviors and our attitudes to align. And part of the challenge with kind of online ecosystems is that if I have said something before that supports a conservative stance, right? And now it comes time to a debate. Well, I've already professed this attitude where if my behavior starts to go against that attitude, it makes me seem as if I am kind of a flip-flopper, as if I am someone who is not internally consistent. And that bothers us. That's one of the most powerful things for actually creating attitude change in individuals, is pointing out when their attitudes and behaviors don't align. So I'll give you a really, really quick example, right? In World War II, the Chinese, when they would capture American POWs, they would have them do essay contests. And the essays would be writing about why communism is not so bad, okay?
Oh my gosh.
And it's an absolutely fascinating example. They understood human psychology really well. So what they would do, right, is they would have American POWs. They would give them an opportunity. They wouldn't force them, and that's critical. They would give them an opportunity to write essays talking about why communism isn't so bad or why America might be wrong with some of its ideologies in exchange for small prizes. Nothing too extravagant, right? Maybe a pack of cigarettes or something like that. Why they did that is because once these American POWs did that, okay, they have a behavioral reference now to say that at some point, right, you did this thing, okay, and we didn't force you to do it. Now you have what's called cognitive dissonance, where I thought that I was someone who believed in capitalism or was against communism, but I've done a behavior that goes against that, okay? And so you have this disconnect between your attitude and your behavior. human beings find that really uncomfortable. And so what ends up happening is we have to resolve that dissonance by either changing our attitudes or changing our behavior. And so what ends up happening is these American POWs end up justifying it by defending what they did, saying, actually, communism isn't that bad. Maybe America doesn't have it great. And so they were leveraging this cognitive dissonance to change people's attitudes. Because cognitive dissonance is so powerful, the statements we've made online prior all act as kind of magnets that we try to stick to. If I've professed hardcore conservative ideologies in the past, the idea of me now changing my mind makes people uncomfortable. It makes them feel as if they are not someone who does as they say and say as they do. And that's something we try to avoid really, really hard. And that works against us when it comes to trying to change someone's mind.
So does that just mean we should not argue online? Because that's kind of where I'm going with this. It's like the part of us humans that really prefers that loop to be closed, which is basically what you're getting to about the cognitive dissonance. Like, we don't like open loops. We want to be like, and case closed. We want to be able to write off people, argue with them with no open-endedness, the kind of open-endedness that allows for nuance and allows for the gray area that is our freaking world, people. Like, it is not a black and white world. But I just don't think online is a great space for that, because not only do we love closed loops and we hate cognitive dissonance, but we also love entertainment. And we are the most understimulated I think we've probably ever been in history, right? Like, we're always on something, we're always doing something, and yet, like, we need more dopamine. And being outraged, unfortunately, gives us a lot of dopamine.
It does.
So it's kind of like we have one word that we're using, arguing, maybe debate, we could throw in that. We have these two English words, but it's almost like the kind of that happens online, it needs its own freaking word because it has no goal.
I tend to agree with that, right? Most of online arguing is just kind of signaling to your group that I am a good group member and I think these people are idiots. I think you're absolutely right that online ecosystems are probably never going to change minds of the individuals that are involved in the debates themselves. Now, what I will say is that I don't think online arguing is useless if we look at something like the kind of unintended byproduct. So if I am an individual who is watching from the sidelines and I see this conservative individual give a perspective that I had never thought about before, the progressive individual on the sidelines who is not under that kind of social pressure of making sure I represent the group well, they have an opportunity to kind of reflect on that and say, oh, I've never really thought about that. And this is actually a really critical point because I, along with other individuals who study things like persuasion, would make the argument that you and I rarely will ever directly persuade someone. Ultimately, it's the person themselves that needs to do the persuading. If I'm trying to kind of convince you of something, the best I can do is approach you in the right way and provide you with different ways that you can reflect on something. But ultimately, the change comes in you having the space and opportunity to reflect on those things in a non-judgmental, non-threatening way. And so debates online can potentially bring about change. It's just almost never the people who are actually within the debates. It's the people that are sitting on the sidelines watching that might have, a little bit of an aha moment that I've never really thought about it that way. But what I would say is if you want to change someone's mind online, the only way you can really do it directly and stand a chance is by getting them in kind of a one-on-one private chat room type thing where they don't have a bunch of people from both sides glaring at them and watching what they say, because if that's the case, then they have to watch what they say as well.
That's so true. I'm reflecting on an online argument I had, probably the last one, because I'm like, this is not, this is a young woman's game. I'm out. I'm out. I'm out. I don't have the energy for this. But it was about a mural that was painted on a street during June-ish 2020 in our town that said Black Lives Matter. And one of my Facebook friends got upset about it. And English is her second language. So we switched to Spanish, but we were still like on that public page. And then I private messaged her and we continued the conversation. And then in private, she was like, but what about Latino lives? And I was like, all of this is because your Peruvian flag is not on the concrete on Garden Street. Oh, okay. Argument over, I guess. And so it is very revealing. But I want to move on to in-person debates, if that's okay with
of
you.
course.
How important is it to have basic facts in common with the person that you're trying to influence? Because you mentioned earlier pro-life, pro-choice.
Sure.
For example, like, when does life begin? If you can't agree on this one basic question, how can you have a productive debate with someone?
You might not be able to, is the answer to that. I mean, unfortunately, you mentioned at the beginning, right? My undergrad degree is in philosophy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to tease about philosophy majors, sure. But one of the things philosophy is incredibly good at is defining terms. And it seems like, for some people, it seems pedantic to go on and on about how we define something. But ultimately, these definitions matter. They play a huge role in what we're arguing about and what side we're going to take. And so I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of times where if you can't agree on a definition, then there's just not really much point in having the argument, right? It's kind of a non-starter at that point. But, I think it's an interesting point to be at, right? Let's take pro-life and pro-choice, for instance. Let's say you get to a point where you can't agree on a definition of when life begins. And so you kind of come to this realization that we're never going to be able to have a real debate about this because we can't agree on terms. There's two directions you can go at this point. Now, most people end up going the direction, and understandably so. They get frustrated. They say, listen, you're regressive and closed-minded, or you're completely naive and you have no morals. And they attack one another, and they end up kind of leaving upset with each other. But more importantly, they end up leaving thinking that side is a bunch of jerks, right? That side is a bunch of these type of people, which prevents any type of persuasion in the future. This is what I get when I'm talking about things like the importance of approach. We have literature to show that if individuals don't like the person they're talking with, they become more inclined towards what we call motivated reasoning, trying to figure out ways to reason in a way that I can make sure that they look bad, right? That I can make sure that they're not going to come out looking good. And so there's this opportunity there at the end where you can say, if let's say I was a pro-life individual and you're a pro-choice individual, and we can't come to a conclusion. And at the end of it, instead of calling me an idiot, you say, hey, listen, I don't know if we're going to be able to have a conversation about this because we can't agree on it. I want to make sure I respect your opinion. I certainly don't want to force my opinion upon you. Here's something that I've always thought. And you kind of leave them with an opportunity to reflect on something. That is probably your best bet at persuading, because you're definitely not going to persuade them by insulting them, and you're going to inhibit your ability to persuade them in the future by doing so. But by respecting their autonomy and leaving them with something to reflect upon, they certainly might not change their mind. But you plant a seed that maybe, because you've done it in a non-threatening way, has the opportunity to grow, where they can reflect on it and not feeling like it's a threat to their ego, a threat to their identity. That's really one of the keys of persuasion. We call this kind of self-persuasion, but ultimately, I'll give a really quick example, right? You go to a museum and you walk up to, this beautiful sculpture, and you're in a room all by yourself, and you look to the left and you see a do not touch the art sign. What's the first thing you want to do?
Touch the art.
You want to touch the art. Everyone wants to touch the art. This is a phenomenon that psychologists have studied called psychological reactance. Basically, when people feel that their autonomy is being threatened, that they're being forced to do or think in a particular way, we instinctively push back, right? And it's such a knee-jerk reaction that we'll do it for things that we actually want to do, right? I love ice cream, but if we were in an argument and you were like, yeah, go ahead and eat that ice cream, all of a sudden I'm going to be like, fuck you, I'm not going to eat the ice cream, right? Like, that's psychological reactance. And it's this natural human tendency that we have to push back when someone's trying to force us to do something. The same thing happens, it especially happens when it comes to arguments and persuasion. The more forceful I try to be in getting you to think the way I do, the more we tend to push back. And so ultimately, the most powerful thing you can do when you're trying to persuade someone is not try to force them to think like you, to head your language, to respect their autonomy and say, hey, this is just the way I know maybe I'm not right. This is the way I've always thought about it. I've always believed this. And so it's been great talking with you. And, we go our separate ways. Yeah. That is the only opportunity where they might actually reflect on that in the comfort and space and safety of their own homes and say, hey, maybe they do have a point. Maybe I should think more about that.
It's interesting how much a person who truly wants to persuade someone would have to let go of the point system. Yeah. Like, you can't be wrapped up in like, I made them change their mind. Like, you got to let go of wanting credit for the changed mind. You have to just release it.
So when I do workshops, right, I don't encourage everyone to take this approach, right? You do need people on both sides who are going to be the passionate mouthpieces. Those individuals are really good. They're really useful for riling the people who already agree with you up. But when you want to change someone's mind, you need to have this really challenging conversation with yourself. Am I willing to do something that is not as fun for me? It doesn't get me points with my group, right? And it's not going to be as satisfying, right, as kind of telling someone off. But it's the one thing that might actually change someone's mind on the other side of the aisle, right? Am I willing to do that? And that's a very hard thing to do because you're right. You have to kind of put aside all these things that, give us, a sense of purpose and a sense of, ego to a degree, right? And we have to kind of let that, take a back seat to what actually works. And what actually works is not as fun.
When it comes to finding those baseline definitions that you are in agreement on in order to build an argument, what about the more subtle ones? Like, here's an example that happened in real life. So I was talking with someone and he was like, they're turning our kids trans. And I was like, oh, wow, I see that really upsets you. Who's they? So I'm like oriented in who you're, I was being very genuine. I wasn't being a smartass because you can do this in a smartass way.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And that's really important.
And so I think that is like, I hope it's a point that people are not missing here. Like, you can't just say the right things as a prescription and be a snarky smartass and be surprised why that person never wants to talk to you again. So anyway, I was genuinely like, okay, they are turning your kid trans. Who's they? And he got kind of flustered and didn't know who they was. And I was like, no, really, like, I just want to know, who is it? The school? Like, is it people online? Like, who's they? And he's like, they. And he got more upset. And so it was clear he couldn't answer the question. So I steered the conversation in a completely other direction and I changed the subject. Was that the wrong approach?
No, I actually think that's the right thing to do, right? Because what you were able to do is you were able to, take an approach that was non-threatening, because you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head that there's a very big difference between asking who's they and who the hell is they, right? It's the same question, right? But the second one puts people on the defensive, right? They're trying to make me look foolish, and so I have to hit back. And once they do that, there's no persuasion happening, right? It's both sides trying not to look foolish. But asking, I'm sorry, like, I'm not as familiar with this. Who is they, in a genuine way. Now, that flustered that man, but that's actually a good sign for you, right? Because what that means is that they reflected and weren't able to come up with who they were. And so what you did at that point is actually the best thing to do, right? By steering the conversation, you've now left him with uncertainty. You've left this individual with a way to kind of soften their stance because they realize there was a question they really didn't have an answer to, and it wasn't, followed up with you making them feel foolish for not having an answer. You just kind of allowed them to sit in that uncertainty and realize that maybe I can't be as rigid with these opinions. There's a phenomenon I'll touch upon really quick, which fits really well here. Do you know how a zipper works or a toilet or something like that, right? You ask someone this question, and if you're like the vast majority of people, we immediately say, yeah, right? If someone asks me how do I know how a zipper works? Of course I know how a zipper works, right? I have zippers all the time. Of course I know how a toilet works. And then you say, okay, how? Right? And it's not just, well, you pull it up and it closes, right? I want to know the process. I want to know the details of the mechanisms, right? How does that clasp together? How are they designed where they actually, hold together tight? Is it magnets? Is there something in there? Are zippers different? Are there different types of zippers? With a toilet, when you flush it, does the water go down first? Does it go down the same pipe? Are there multiple pipes? What ends up happening in these situations is most people express a lot of confidence that they know how these things work at the beginning. And then once they're forced to kind of walk through the process of how they work, they come to realize there's a knowledge gap there, right? And psychologists refer to this as the illusion of explanatory depth. When there are things that we deal with all the time, we tend to believe we know how they work. We have a familiarity with them that we mistake as expertise. And once we're made to understand that, hey, actually, you don't understand these things as well as you thought, we experience this sensation of intellectual humility. They soften their stances because they realize they just don't have the data to back them up. And so when you talk about that stance that you had with that individual, right, where you kind of asked them, who are we talking about here? And he had this pause where he kind of came to this realization that he doesn't really know. That's a beautiful place to be, because that's this individual coming to this realization that I don't understand this as well as my kind of fervor that I feel about it would suggest. And so maybe I need to dial that back a little bit before I understand it.
I'm wondering if you are an asshole online, on like social media, if you would even be able to do that in real life. Because most of us who we interact with in person, we are also connected with on social. So like if a social person on social media, like I'm on social media, but I don't, like I said, that last Black Lives Matter thing, I was like, you know what? This is not for me. I am out. Y'all can keep this. Thank you. Goodbye. But let's say I wasn't like that. And I had spoken out like about pro-trans rights or something. Yeah. That person would have seen that and would have interpreted my asking as snarky no matter what. Yeah. So I almost wonder, again, I mean, I hate to be such a Luddite, but I'm kind of wondering, like, if we should just sit on our hands. Like, y'all just need a good old-fashioned kindergarten timeout, because the arguments you're making online to show off for your group are hurting your in-person relationships, and they're not promoting your cause. So then one would have to ask, this is getting real philosophical. We're getting real deep now. One would have to ask is like, do you actually believe that then? Or are you just showing off for your group? Because if you actually believed it, you would not hit tweet. You would put your phone down and do something else and like go talk to your neighbor.
First of all, let me just say that I think you're absolutely right when you say that individuals who create an online persona that is antagonistic, that is aggressive, that is unreasonable in many ways, they do compromise their ability to persuade people in real life. So I think that's right. I think the question about, whether these people believe it or not can come down to two things. First, again, it gets to this point of this misunderstanding of what actually persuades people. Some of these people online do think that if I hammer home how stupid you are over and over, and I keep making fun of you enough, right, eventually you're going to have to submit and say, hey, I was stupid and naive and you're absolutely right. Now, it's a completely ludicrous and naive way to think that persuasion works. But some people do end up believing that. The only opinion they care about is that of their group, right? If you talk to the strategists within their groups, the individuals that are actually trying to kind of get change, to get people to come over to their side, to make the group bigger, right? These people are huge detriments. It makes it very, very hard for them to kind of recruit people who are more moderate, who are on the fence. They become a really impediment to being able to kind of grow in that way.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
You're going to get kicked out of the group. So when I think about moments that have changed my mind, I think about stories. To me, it's the stories of people that have changed my heart, because I do want to emphasize there's a difference between saying the right thing because certain words or certain phrasing of things has become unpopular, and changing of heart. Those are totally different. When I moved from Nebraska to Florida, in Nebraska, I don't know, I just thought definitely being gay was a choice. And where I live in Florida, there is a thriving queer community. My neighbors were two women who were together. I moved in, they came over and knocked on my door, welcoming me in the neighborhood. And it was, I can tell story after story of women who were just so lovely and like let me into their lives. I remember sitting with one woman, and you could tell she was older, had been through some things. Gay marriage wasn't legal yet. And I said, well, what inspired you to move to Pensacola? She was from London, actually. Cool. And she said, oh, love. And I was like, oh, cool. Is he military? I just was so ignorant. Yeah. And through different layers of conversations that day, she decided that I was safe enough that she would share with me. And I could tell it was a moment, I could see it in her eyes, where she decided that I was safe enough. And witnessing that is something you could never replicate online. And then she told me the struggles with insurance and child custody. And I found myself like getting upset about her situation for her on her behalf. Like, what the hell, those people? And I was like, wait a minute, fuck, I'm that people. and it was story after story like this. I could go on, but that specifically changed my mind on this issue. And so I'm wondering, in your work, is there research that shows that storytelling is effective? Like, is that an effective strategy even?
Not only is there research on it, but it is one of the most effective strategies for persuasion, for changing minds, is story. I'll take a step back because I think there's something really, really useful that I can talk about right now. And it has to do exactly with what you're saying, with the idea of same-sex marriage. So many Americans will recall Prop 8, which was the proposition in California about making, I think it was about making same-sex marriage illegal. Basically, I think it was 52% basically said that we don't want same-sex marriage to be legal. Okay. There were individuals that were working in the canvassing community at that point that were absolutely devastated, right? They were like, we really thought people in our community were going to come out and support this. And so they were trying to figure out why their canvassing hadn't worked. Now, canvassing at this point in time, if we go back to like the mid-2000s, it was all about, this idea that, if you're going to persuade someone, right, give them a good argument. Okay, so they were going out and they were telling them all the, logical reasons why voting same-sex marriage, it shouldn't be a big deal. They went back to these people and they went back into their communities and they were like, we want to figure out why people voted this way. And they ended up coming to this really important realization that there was no argument they could give. This is their words, by the way. There was no argument that we could give that could change their mind. There was no superior piece of information or data that was going to change these people's minds. And so they ended up basically scrapping the whole canvassing playbook and trying to figure out what actually works. And they came up with something that they call deep canvassing. And one of the cornerstones of deep canvassing is storytelling. It's if I am trying to change your mind about same-sex marriage, right? One option is I can come and talk to you about all the data about same-sex marriage. The other thing I can do is I can say, hey, do you mind if I tell you a quick story about my friend and the love of his life who ended up, moving somewhere for each other and falling in love and couldn't wait to spend their lives together. And then all of a sudden, they realized they couldn't get married and they had to, break things off. And it can touch you in a way, as you just said, right? That this story touched you. And this is a phenomenon that's been studied, by the way. It's called narrative transportation theory. When we're presented with data and arguments, if those things run counter to what we believe, our inclination is to figure out what are counter arguments for that, right? So when you're giving me your argument, I'm trying to figure out in my head, how do I rebut this? Stories do something really, really special, because when we hear stories, rather than trying to find holes in them, we tend to simulate. We tend to imagine what that was like. We tend to imagine what the emotional state of that person was. We tend to empathize with what that person, that character in the story, was going through. And by doing so, we bypass that tendency towards reactance that I talked about, right? To push back. Stories are able to kind of change our minds in a really gentle way because it lowers our defensiveness. It makes us kind of just resonate with someone as opposed to look for ways to fight them. And so deep canvassing, one of the first things they figured out is our cornerstone needs to be stories. And secondly, we need to be asking people questions rather than telling them facts. And this gets into what psychologists call self-persuasion. They realize that the only person that was going to change these people's minds were themselves. And so their whole goal in deep canvassing is to get them to reflect on their own thinking. They came to this realization that a lot of people hold really strong views on things that they haven't actually thought about that deeply, right? And a lot of it could be because we just trust what our group believes. If my group is against same-sex marriage, then I'm really against same-sex marriage, even though maybe I've never thought about it for more than 10 seconds before. But what they want to do is they want to give these people a rare opportunity to actually think about their own thinking without judgment, without threat or fear from their group members, and give them the opportunity to reflect on why they hold these views. Do they really have the data and the evidence to hold them in such a strong way? And so deep canvassing has kind of come out with all the best research from psychology and behavioral science and put it to use towards changing people's minds. And storytelling is an absolute cornerstone of it.
So when it comes to set and setting of changing people's minds, a story can be shared at any moment, in person or online, actually, now that I think about it. But when it comes to I don't know, I feel like the little statements, the quips that come out that give you indication that maybe some stories need to be told, right? Like the nonchalant racist comment, or, it's always that God, I don't have time for this. It's always like you're like, okay, bye, see you later. Or you're at the grocery store and you're like, I have to be at a doctor's appointment.
Yeah.
What is the ideal set and setting for changing people's mind? Or am I just overthinking it and these micro opportunities are really where the gold is?
Micro opportunities are not easy. There's a lot of pressure on those singular moments to try to do something. And a lot of times when we are caught off guard, it is our inclination to be like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And in that moment, it's hard to approach someone in a way that's going to make them receptive to what I have to say. And so I think sometimes it does need to be a particular setting. And ultimately, what I would say is it's a process. The first thing that you need to develop a sense of comfort and trust with someone, that I can have these vulnerable conversations where I question my beliefs, where I question something that I've built my identity upon. That's an incredibly vulnerable thing to do. And you don't just have those type of conversations with just anyone. It takes time.
What about formulas for questions to keep in your back pocket? And I ask this because I feel like if anyone has questions in their back pocket, it might be you. Much in the way that I asked that one guy to say, okay, well, who is they? Yeah. Or wow, you sound really committed to that. How long have you felt that way? I hate to have one-liners, but they are helpful sometimes.
I'll give two kind of question-related pieces of advice. The first would be shift as much as you can from why questions to how questions. Okay. Individuals, when you ask them, right, why is the economy bad? Why is, the stock market going up, right? We often have these canned responses for these things that we've been fed by the media or by our groups about why it's because of the president, it's because of this, because of that. How questions, like we were talking about with the illusion of explanatory depth, right? How questions require engagement. It requires individuals to actually stop and think rather than just regurgitate things that they've rehearsed with their groups online. So how questions are much more powerful at getting individuals, forcing individuals to kind of dig into a topic and reflect upon it. And that's one of the first things we need to do, because we all feel like all of our opinions are bulletproof on the surface level when we're only just talking with people who agree with us, right? We've never been challenged. We think we have all the answers because our group gives us all the right answers. But when we're forced to kind of defend those in a much more realistic way by going through how questions and trying to talk through, it creates this useful tension in the minds of people. And so shifting from why questions to how questions, again, asking those how questions in a really non-judgmental way. You can't just say, well, how do they do that with your hands on your hips, right? That you're not going anywhere. But asking how questions in a super polite, almost like, not self-deprecating, but almost like being super humble yourself, right? Like modeling that type of intellectual humility and saying, hey, I don't exactly know this, but can you talk me through like how this happens, right? That's how you need to ask those questions. But the second thing is one of the most powerful mechanisms of change are techniques that are derived from a psychotherapeutic modality called motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is this technique, right, where you're basically just kind of asking individuals questions and getting them to reflect upon certain things. And
that's also a sales technique.
It is a sales technique. It is something that is used in other forms, right?
Yeah.
One of the most powerful techniques within motivational interviewing that I really love to recommend, and it's also used in deep canvassing. They call it the 2-question motivation technique. So let's say you're talking to someone about same-sex marriage, right? Let's say they were against same-sex marriage and you're trying to convince them that same-sex marriage is not so bad. And you ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I'm not against it at all, 10 being I'm completely against it, how against same-sex marriage are you, right? Now, some people are going to say a 10, right? And those people are going to be really, really hard to move, and this technique is not going to work on them. But many people are going to give you an answer like a 9 or 8 or a 7. And the second question, which is the critical one, you say, why didn't you choose a higher number? Now, what you've done here is you're giving them an opportunity to reflect on why same-sex marriage isn't so bad, right? Why didn't I go with 10, right? What are the things about same-sex marriage that made me say 7 or 8 or 9, right? So you're giving them this opportunity without you forcing it upon them to reflect upon why maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was, and giving them that opportunity to reflect in a way that you haven't put words in their mouth, right? You're just kind of asking them to talk through things that they have volunteered. That's really, really powerful for individuals. That's what gives individuals the opportunity to really think through their own thinking and perhaps find a little more space for moderation in their views.
As we wrap up, I have a couple of, reflection questions for you, because at the core of all of this is that we as individuals would grow, that we don't want to live in a time capsule,
Sure.
right? We want to go to the next place and make sure that our minds are sharp and that we stay relevant. And I think a big part of that is reading. I heard you say that you yourself did not become a reader until a little bit later in life. And so based on your own experience of late entry, what kind of books would you recommend that people start with in order to maintain that sharpness and relevancy?
I would say start with whatever invigorates you or sparks your curiosity, right? Whatever doesn't feel, either something that doesn't feel like a drag to pick up, or the type of thing that might feel like a drag to pick up, but you know you'll be better when you put it down, right? Those are kind of the two criteria I would think about. But, for me, psychology was kind of a natural stepping stone. And so I will give a shout out to this book, because this is the book that really sent me down the path of like becoming a psychologist. The very first book I read on psychology, and thank God I did, it's called The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson. There's another book by the same name by a guy by the name of David Brooks. I'm sure that's very good as well. I've never personally read it. But The Social Animal by Elliot Aronson was written like back in the 1970s. It still to this day holds up as like the epitome of social psychology introduction. And so if you want to pick up a book, you haven't done it in a while, you want to learn a little bit more about human nature, Social Animal is a great place to start.
Last question. What is something that you've changed your mind about?
That's a good question. I have come to change my mind about the value of having debate. And I know that sounds weird after the conversation we just had, but the more I read about political psychology, the more I realize that I am someone who just very naturally, I am a very progressive person. I've always been a very liberal person. I have, conservative friends and colleagues and family, but for me, it's just always been, this is what I think is the right way to do things. The more I read about political psychology, the more I come to understand that you need a little bit of tension in a society. Now, we've taken it quite to the extreme and maybe we've gone overboard, right? But the policies that I believe in, the policies I fight for, if left to institute every single one of these things completely unencumbered by alternate perspectives from the conservative side, there are vulnerabilities to them, right? Like I am someone who I want to, given my perfect world, I do want to have, open borders, and I do want to have people, just living in harmony and all these different things. But guess what? There is issues with these things. People will take advantage of it. People will victimize me for my naivety, and right? So although I don't agree with my conservative colleagues, although I'll continue to fight them on what the right thing to do is, I've started to have a little bit more of an appreciation that as a society, we need a little bit of that tension. We need someone to challenge us, right? So even though I still feel very strongly about my opinion, I start to understand the weaknesses of it. I start to understand, right, where I need to kind of plug those gaps, where I need to think a little bit deeper rather than just have someone on my own side tell me that I'm absolutely right and it would work perfectly, right? And so I've come to change my mind about the value of having individuals debate, because even if no one is persuaded per se, it's an opportunity to understand that there are vulnerabilities in your beliefs and your ideologies. There are things that you need to work on. And the only way you start to understand those things is by talking with someone who doesn't agree with you.
I couldn't think of a better way to close this out.
Awesome.
What a beautiful closing sentiment. Tell people where they can stay in touch with your work, your research, and whatever's next for you.
The best place is going to be the website, influence51.com. I work with clients across a variety of different fields on things like influence, persuasion, strategic communication, not just political campaigns. We're talking large organizational leaders, charities and nonprofits, even places like lawyers and financial advisors and healthcare practitioners. We can all kind of learn different ways to approach individuals that leads to better results. And so influence51.com, you can reach me there. I will also go ahead and just give my email. It's on the website anyway, CEO@influence51.com. If you have any questions, comments, if you just want to yell at me and get in a debate, you can reach me there as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Tat. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meredith. Appreciate you having me.